Hey, what's up out there in YouTube land? Happy Friday. Happy First Nation Friday. Thank you so much for joining us today on Stir Crazy. You guys know what this is. This is where we spend the hour, albeit a tad bit late, but that's okay. We are on colored people's time. So sometimes we may not show up at the appointed time, but we're going to get there at some point or another. Welcome to episode number 89. And today's episode is Indigenous Freedom is a Lifelong Struggle. A lot of what we're seeing happening out in the streets right now for the movement for Black lives is 100% applicable to Native and Indigenous lives as well when it comes to voter suppression, when it comes to police brutality and police accountability. These are very much Native issues. And first and foremostly, Native folks have been enduring these struggles longer than other oppressed communities. So they have certainly felt the sting of denial of sovereignty, consequently denial of citizenship, and denial of constitutional and civil rights at the hands of the state forever. And these issues certainly persist into 2020. So several things are on the docket today. We're going to talk about, first of all, Native representation or Native misrepresentation when it comes to entertainment in Hollywood, how non-Native actors and actresses are being cast to fill Native roles, and how Natives are being portrayed in some mainstream productions. And I'm thinking about Lovecraft Country. Am I saying that right? All the hip kids out there, the series on HBO featured some Native representation that has come under a lot of criticism, justified and therein. So we're going to talk about some of the issues percolating with that. Also, two tribes in South Dakota are alleging voter suppression on behalf of the state as we quickly approach Election Day. And we know that minorities communities or communities of color are targeted to suppress their vote, to suppress their voice, and to suppress their expression. This is still happening, still very much a thing. Also, we're going to talk about how defund the police and abolish the police are very much Indigenous issues. As I mentioned before, there's a case coming out of Washington State where a 28-year-old Native man died while in police custody, and the coroner has recently ruled his death a homicide. We'll get into some details of that. But where we want to begin is with a bit of good news. One of the water protectors from Standing Rock has been released from federal jail after being there for 4 years. Red Fawn Fallis is free, and we're going to talk about her story right now after I introduce our wonderful First Nation Friday panel. And we've got a new face on our panel today, and we are so excited to be joined with Natalie. Natalie is the founder of the HeSapa Voter Initiative, which is an urban Indian clinic effort focused on COVID-19 community response and the November election. Natalie, I'm sorry, I need to pull up my viewfinder so I can read your wonderful name. Natalie Means is joining us today from Rapid City, South Dakota. Do I have that right, or is it Iowa?
That's me. Hello.
Thank you, Natalie, for being here. And of course, we're joined with our community activist and organizer representing Oklahoma by way of California. She is Johnnie J. We love Johnnie J. Fan favorite around here. Hello, Johnnie J. How are you doing today, sweetie?
Pretty good.
And of course, as you see, we are missing Jen Dearnwater and Desiree Kane. They couldn't join us today, but they are, of course, with us in spirit. So we say hello and send love to them as well. But gang, let's go ahead and get started with this First Nation Friday. As I mentioned, we have some good news for once to talk about off the top of the show, and that is the release of Red Fawn Fallis. I hope I'm saying her name properly. Red Fawn was one of the most vocal and visible water protectors during the Standing Rock siege, so to speak, in 2015, where water protectors came out by the thousands to block the Dakota Access Pipeline that was traversing through South Dakota and threatening Native lands. I want us to run this video if we could really quick. I'm going to talk over it because this is a video that was shot by Renegade Media back in 2017 after Red Fawn had been arrested and convicted of federal charges, and she was sentenced to 57 months. So let's take a look at that as we see the people definitely came out in support of her release. There's a lot of dubious tactics utilized by the federal government in order to arrest her, to bring her into custody. We know our own Desiree Kane was intimately familiar of what happened to Red Fawn. But as you see from these pictures, again, this was back in 2017, the aerial shots of the people coming out, standing up in support of their sister, demanding her freedom, demanding her release. And finally, after 4 long years, she was locked up in California in a federal prison. She has been released. She is back home with her people. She's back home with her family. Natalie, I want to start with you because obviously we know that people who stand up against the colonialist system here in the United States, who stand up against capitalism, who stand in defense of natural resources, more specifically the water, more specifically Indian sovereignty, these people are targeted for arrest, for imprisonment, for harassment, for a myriad of things that not only the activists at Standing Rock experience, but Native people have been experiencing in these ways and worse ways for generations now. Talk to us about what it means for Red Fawn to finally be free after spending 4 long years in federal custody.
You know, a lot of prayers went into Red Fawn's release and her safety these last 4 years since Standing Rock. You know, as far as I'm concerned, the incidents and the undercover operative and various, tactics that were deployed by the federal government, for me, I consider her a victim of a sexual violation of sexual violence at the hands of the federal government. The repression that took place at Standing Rock was something that really increased and opened my eyes and my consciousness to what social change really is up against in terms of the status quo. Our opposition wasn't just the federal government, the United States, it was also TransCanada and their private mercenaries that contributed to much of the negative narrative regarding what we were doing in protecting the water at the Cannonball River. I was there with my 2-year-old daughter at the time, and we camped and spent a significant amount of time from August until December. And I think that, October 26th, October 27th, those were key days that they showed their brute strength and what devious tactics they would use in order to stifle our constitutional rights, our natural rights as human beings and as Indigenous people, protecting the lands that we steward and that continue to be our treaty lands, that continue to be unceded, occupied treaty lands. And Red Fawn's freedom, or at least partial freedom now, she's still on paper, but it is a blessing. We're very proud of our sister Red Fawn as Lakota people for the stand that she took. And we will continue to support her against the nefarious and malicious intent of many governmental officials who seek to stifle, our human rights here in the Dakotas.
Desiree has been speaking about Red Fawn's plight and some of the things that you just alluded to, Natalie. Desiree has been so gracious to inform the rest of us about. Can we pop up Desiree's tweet real quick about Red Fawn's release, Dwayne? Okay, so Harvesters Revolution on the prison line, they tweeted about Red Fawn's release. Red Fawn is home. She was kidnapped by police at Standing Rock 2016 and spent 4 years in prison. I remember when it happened, and I'm so happy she's home, a water protector and hero. Of course, a sentiment shared by many across Indian country. And here we go with Desiree Kane. Desiree tweeted, learning Red Fawn Fallis, the woman who, hold on, excuse me, move this out the way. The woman the FBI sponsored the sexual assault of by informant Heath Harmon from MHA Nation is free today. Hashtag free Red Fawn, hashtag no dapple. Big O, ladies, say the O for me correctly, because I'm not native. I know I'm not saying, I'm not giving this its proper respect here. But what Desiree said, for her sacrifice, for the movement, may we all learn for how she remained strong when everything was wrong. Johnnie, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Red Fawn's case, but the fact that she was targeted in more ways than one, not only for criminal action by the feds, and as Natalie alluded, by corporate entities such as TransCanada. The story, and I don't want to speak too much because I don't know enough to really get into the details. But from what I've been able to glean is that the FBI informant was sent to be a romantic partner for her, basically, and fooled her into thinking his intentions were something more than protecting the water at Standing Rock, and helped to gather intelligence that was eventually used against her. I mean, just the most deplorable tactics that you can think of. And that's why Natalie referred to it, I believe, as a sexual assault by the federal government.
Oh, I absolutely agree. My mind was blown by this case. From her arrest, seeing her being thrown to the ground, and to have so many men on top of her and in acting violence in her arrest when she wasn't fighting back. She wasn't, everything that they said that she was doing, she just wasn't doing at all. And to see that was terrifying, because you have this Native woman who is just being tackled by all these men. And for them to say that, she had a gun, and it just seemed really sketchy. And the more that the story came out, the more I was just like, wow, this is really what is going on. This is what Native people are experiencing in terms of informants being sent into this unarmed, peaceful protest camp where, we have water protectors who are there standing up for their rights, standing up for the water, and being targeted, like people going into this area to not only get information, but also to plant. Like they were planting drugs, they were planting guns, they were also trying to coerce people into acting violently, to go against what the water protectors were there to do. So, that was something that just blew my mind, just the gravity of what was going on. And with Red Dawn, the story that, she had a relationship with this man, and that he was an informant and nobody knew, and it was also kind of terrifying too when you look at this gun, because the camp was unarmed, and 48 hours prior to her arrest, he had access to all her belongings. And, it's people that family members have come out and said that he basically jacketed her. The gun that she was accused of shooting and that was taken into evidence belonged to him. It didn't belong to her. So, it's gross. And it's also something that, Native people aren't new to. We've been very well informed of anytime we have movements, anytime we have gatherings, that we do need to be careful of informants, because that's what they do. They send people in to disrupt movements. We've seen it with, before Standing Rock, we've seen it with several AIM movements. We've also seen it, in other movements where people of color have gathered to try and stand up for their rights. It's just, the U.S. government doing what the U.S. government does, trying to disrupt justice and trying to deny justice by any means possible, even if that means causing us to turn against one another, to be distrustful of one another, and also to be set up by them just because maybe we trust the wrong people at the wrong times. And I think that's definitely what happened here. And it's just, I'm so glad she's free, because almost 5 years, that she's been in prison, and for something that she wasn't done. There was no real evidence, no concrete evidence. Like, this is something, like, she was a political prisoner is the way that I see it. And I'm so glad that she was able to be freed, because now, it kind of gives us the opportunity, and her the opportunity, to tell her story, and to also, start living her life, but also to keep standing up for what she originally stood up for in the begin with, which is the rights of our water, the rights of Indigenous people. And, that's something that imprisoning natives, imprisoning activists especially, is just a silencing tactic. It's to take them out of the public eye, and also to try and invalidate their credibility within the mainstream public. And so I'm glad that she's free and can continue her work.
Lady, I mean, you guys, I'm just so blown away at the amount of fortitude that Red Fawn had to have in order to survive this ordeal, because we know that natives are killed more by police even than Black Americans, right? So it was no guarantee that she was going to survive the encounter with police, or even survive her time demonstrating at Standing Rock. I wanted to get your take on the particular vulnerabilities of Native women when it comes to being active and organizing and advocating on behalf of Indigenous lives and Indigenous land rights and water rights and sovereignty. Natalie, what is your take on what you have seen, not just what happened to Red Fawn, but to other Indigenous women who have been visible and vocal about demanding liberation and sovereignty?
Well, I think Indigenous women are vulnerable in much the same ways that many of our different types of vulnerable people are in our society. That there's an impoverishment that is ongoing, and so people are vulnerable to money. Being put out, being offered money, being offered resources that normally don't accrue to Indigenous women. I think that I think about Red Fawn, and I think about many of the people who had to do time out of Standing Rock, or who faced really serious charges. And I think it's important to note that the war on drugs is what led to these long sentences for many of our water protectors who faced, the justice system at the federal level in North Dakota, where the chance of getting an objective, neutral, or unbiased jury was impossible. And that's why I believe that most of them took a plea. We have the deal, the plea bargain that Red Fawn was forced into taking was because of the war on drugs, and because of her previous felony, and the mass and over-incarceration of Indigenous women for relatively minor drug offenses. That is definitely something that has decimated what one would call a critical mass, or a cadre, or our community leadership generally. So many incarceration survivors, so many people who have been dinged by drug felonies and so forth, that, when she was faced with the arrest that she was put under arrest, she had a drug felony. And with that felony background, plus, a contaminated jury pool in North Dakota of people who would be biased against our water protectors, she had little choice but to accept that plea bargain. And those are the type of, I guess in public health, you might call them social determinants, is what people are saying lately. But, I think it's just the regular old one too. It's impoverishment, and it's a racism, and it's colonialism. It's paint by the numbers in terms of what is causing our people to suffer, and what is causing our people to be sent off to prison, instead of getting a fair shot before our justice system and before these courts.
There's another case involving an Indigenous person detained by police, tribal police, for a minor drug offense, and who subsequently died while in police custody. So late December of 2019, in Thurston County, Washington State. 28-year-old David, his name is Joseph Cagey. 28 years old. He's from the Lummi Nation, Lummi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So let me give you a little bit of background about what happened to this young man. So he was picked up by the Lummi Tribal Police December 18th, 2019. He was booked into the Nisqually jail on suspected drug paraphernalia possession violation. This is all reported by the Seattle Times and the Bellingham Herald. So subsequently, what happened to Mr. Cagey after he was, like I said, arrested by tribal police, charged with a minor drug offense, and taken to a neighboring jail, because there's no jail on the tribal lands. They actually contract these services out to detention centers, in their area. He was there for a couple of days, and then he eventually became unresponsive. They took him to hospital, and he died a day later. Now, there has been an ongoing investigation for the past 9 months as to the cause of Mr. Cagey's death. And what the coroner's office has recently determined, like I said, it took them 9 months to come to this, is that his death has been ruled a homicide. And what the coroner had determined is that he died as a result of opioid withdrawal, which caused him to be dehydrated, which caused his electrolytes to be all off. Now, some people might be asking, well, how is opioid withdrawal classified as a homicide? Well, for the simple reason is if you are in police custody, the police are supposed to attend to your medical needs, and his needs were not attended to. So, whereas it is extremely rare for a person to die from opioid withdrawal, if you are not given the proper medical care, yeah, you will die, which is exactly why the coroner has determined his death to be a homicide. Now, again, there has been no charges filed as of yet, but the determination of his death being ruled a homicide, hopefully, is the first step to getting some justice for his family and for his people. Johnnie J, the whole reason he was in jail in the first place, to be neglected by those who are supposed to be there to look after his basic medical needs, is because of war on drugs kind of policy, where he was picked up for drug paraphernalia possession. The reports don't specify as to what those alleged drugs or alleged paraphernalia were. But it doesn't sound like it was something that warranted him being incarcerated. Talk to me about how Indian country has been targeted with the war on drugs, with these types of dubious charges for Native people, and how it's, in addition to the war on drugs, when I think about what Natalie was just telling us with Red Fawn, because she had a drug conviction on her record already, she felt as though she didn't have any option but to take a guilty plea, resulting in her 4-year imprisonment. But when it comes to this case with Mr. Cagey, the war on drugs opened the door for him to eventually lose his life. How have tribal police been complicit in pushing arrests on Indigenous folks on tribal lands for things such as drugs?
Well, first of all, I think it kind of goes back to what the Stanford experiment proved, is that power corrupts. It doesn't matter how well your intentions are. Some people, once they get that taste of power, they kind of start tripping on it. And I see that happening a lot with tribal police, because we do internalize a lot of the anti-indigeneity that we're fed within society. And a lot of that comes from the stereotypes that are portrayed. And also because we know our people are hurting. We know we have aunties and uncles and relatives who are alcoholics and who abuse drugs. We know that we have poverty. We know that we have all these situations that we're faced with. And we know the reasons that, our relatives are choosing to try and self-medicate in the ways that they do, or try to suppress what they're feeling in various ways, whether it's through drugs, alcohol, self-harm even. We know that's happening, but we also internalize the hatred that comes from that in seeing that we're fed. Because when you look at how mainstream society views Indigenous people, we're alcoholics, we're drug abusers, we're impoverished, we're defeated, we're broken, we're unfixable, and we're useless. That is the way that in the message that is sent through mainstream media, through all the stereotypes that we see in the media, within the news, and the way that our issues are reported on even. And that has an impact on the way that we think of each other and the way that we feel about ourselves. And, that's exactly why tribal police are complicit, because, they know that we have drug problems. They know that we have alcoholism. And when they pick up, somebody on a drug charge or alcohol charge, they bring them in. Sometimes it's a running joke, oh, so-and-so is back in here. Let him sleep it off and we'll let him go. And I know this firsthand because I do have relatives who have been in that situation where they're picked up because they're drunk, or, they've been picked up on drugs, and they become kind of like a joke to the community because of how often they're picked up on these little infractions just because of they happen to be in public and there just happen to be a cop there. And, it becomes a running joke, and we internalize all that. And so with this case, I see that happening because, also when you're in jail and you're asking for help, it's the same when we go into the hospital and we ask for help there. A lot of times they think we're faking, that we're just after drugs, that we're just trying to get out of whatever situation we're in. They don't believe us. And so for this man to die of the neglect that he did, that's kind of a horrifying reality that we face as Indigenous people, whether we're in jail or whether we're in the hospital, because there is a very good likelihood that we are not going to walk out of there if we are in a medical emergency, simply because of the misconceptions that they have of who Indigenous people are.
Natalie, I want to get your take on the way that the war on drugs has been executed against Indigenous folks, and the way that tribal police help to exacerbate that.
Sure. I think it's important to note that the war on drugs has been used as a proxy and an excuse to tear down tribal sovereignty. And, in pursuit of these bad guys and these villains, tribal sovereignty is virtually, it's erased by these cross-jurisdictional task forces that are set up throughout all of the different states, and that many reservation tribal law enforcement agencies participate in, and they skirt the internal tribal court or tribal justice system by having these kind of task forces. And you can see them, they're often with the U.S. Marshals, they're with the FBI, your county and your city law enforcement agencies. They'll often dress up in military garb and get their SWAT teams out for these type of maneuvers that they take place. And that happens, in a city, in an urban environment, and it's increasingly happening in a reservation environment where violent, what I call violent searches and seizures take place, where homes are invaded of American Indian people. Why this cross-jurisdictional section of law enforcement? And it is only with the permission of the tribe or the tribal police department, law enforcement agency, that they're able to do this. And so definitely the war on drugs has helped to subvert and distort tribal sovereignty, which one big part of that is the general welfare and health of the Indian people, and that the tribal governments are entrusted to address. I want to say that in terms of like the impact on how this war on drugs, and then you have the tribal police departments, and you also have a really powerful internalized stereotype around alcoholism in our American Indian communities that Johnnie was talking about. And that internalized stereotype is not helpful to address the very serious consequences of addiction to alcohol and illegal substances and legal substances that we find ourselves in the United States. 30% of Native Americans abstain from alcohol and drugs altogether. We are the most likely of any ethnic group to be completely sober, and that includes alcohol. So there is a significant, almost a third of us choose to not engage in what is very much a mainstream American cultural pastime, and that is the imbibing alcohol. And I think it's important to note that, wealthy white people are doing their drugs and alcohol perfectly fine. They do it right across here in town, in my city, Rapid City, perfectly fine, without police interventions on a daily basis into their drug use or their addictions. And so access to medical care is a big part of that. And I also want to point out that in terms of, relating this back to Red Fawn, not only did she have a previous drug conviction, but part of the narrative that our local press engaged in was to create was to put her out there as an ugly woman. And Red Fawn, and this is entirely subjective, but she's a very beautiful woman, in fact. And repeatedly, they use these ugly mugshots of her and repeatedly, refer to her previous drug convictions, and then tried to characterize her as violent. So it's this connection, right, of all these different stereotypes that are about subordinating the American Indian in our imaginations and subordinating us as a people in mainstream narratives about what, we are enduring or what we are going through. Like this poor man with the Lummi Police Department, picking up someone for paraphernalia seems to be something that belongs in the 20th century, not certainly in 2020. And you have to look at how they are treating their tribal members who are facing these really serious medical issues, which opiate addiction is. And access to treatment remains to be, one of the biggest hurdles that American Indians face as the poorest, by many measures, the most impoverished population here in the United States. So, I know I took that into a few different places, but I really believe that the war on drug exploits the racism, the white supremacy for their benefit. So not only do they get to sell us the drugs, then they get to monetize us when we're all in prison for doing the drugs that, frankly, white people and wealthy people enjoy on a regular basis without any law enforcement intervention at all.
And I think there's, something that we also kind of failed to note is that when it comes to being charged on Indian land, you have to look at the reason why so many natives who have been convicted have federal felonies or federal charges. And a lot of that is because of the federal jurisdiction that is on our Indian land. So we already have a mark against us in a sense that we're always going to face more serious charges. Chances are they're always going to be considered felonies and they're going to be considered federal charges just because they happen on Indian land. And I think that's one of the things that really bothered me with the way that they were trying to portray Red Dawn Fallis as, a violent druggie and using her felony charge against her, because a lot of people don't understand that when it comes to Indian country, a lot of our charges are going to be considered federal felonies or federal charges. And just like Natalie said, a lot of that is just because we are kind of put in this catch-22 situation where we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, because we're criminalized just for being Indigenous. We're criminalized for things that other Americans do, but face minor charges or don't face any charges at all. Like, we will always face stricter, harsher terms, harsher sentences. It's just the way that they have set this system up. And it goes for other communities as well, beyond the Native community. And it's so bizarre to me that when it comes to Indigenous people, that alcoholism, drug abuse, all of these social issues that other communities face as well, we're the only community that where it's really become synonymous with our identity. Like, in the American mind, you cannot separate alcoholism from the American Indian. You can't separate drug abuse just because of how ingrained these stereotypes are in their psyches and the way that they're continually fed these in the media. And it's so frustrating to me because, as long as these stereotypes continue and as long as they continue to go addressed, then we're not going to be able to address how they impact us in our real lives. Because a lot of people tell us it's just an image or it's just a stereotype. It has no impact, but it really does, because for us as Native people, they impact our political, our educational, our occupational realities in every way. Like, we always have to contend with these stereotypes just to do everyday things. And so it's so frustrating, but I think it is important for people to know that, when it comes to Indigenous people, we're always going to have that federal term just hanging over our heads in every way possible. And just like Natalie said, it's all just to kind of subordinate us, to make us weak, to make us seem like we're defeated, to make it seem that, and to also just remind us as Native people that the American government has their boot on our neck in everything that we do. So we're always going to be facing federal charges. We're always going to be facing federal felonies for anything that we do, just because they can. And I think that's something that's important for people to know.
So the last question I want to pose to you both about this before we move on, and again, I'm not familiar with the geographical area where the gentleman who is deceased was from the Lumi Nation, but I feel as though there's a particular precariousness and vulnerability for Native people who may be arrested on tribal lands by tribal police, but then taken into custody off of tribal lands and into, America, right? The rest of America, white America, for all intents and purposes. I mean, is there? Am I reading too much into that, or is there a legitimate concern for having to be processed in the criminal justice system away from your tribal lands, if that is indeed where you live, where you call home?
You're not wrong. They moved Red Dawn Phallus several times without alerting anybody that she was moved. She was moved to Texas, and like you said, she was released in California. And that's a tactic that they use. They move Indians, hoping that we get lost in this system. Because as long as we're lost, then we can't have the support that we need from the outside. So we are very vulnerable to, it's very likely that she may not have ever come out if she didn't have the support on the outside that she did. If people weren't aware of her story, she very well could have been one of those political prisoners that they shuffle around, and who knows what would have happened to her or what could have happened to her, and we never would have known. She would have just been lost, and they would have just been like, well, job done.
Mm-hmm. Natalie, the Lumi Nation, their business collective, has voted to end the contract with the jail where the gentleman was found dead. What are your thoughts about Indigenous people arrested on Native lands but being subjected to the criminal justice system outside of tribal authority?
Well, we have had here in South Dakota, we have had our local law enforcement in the city and the county, take violent actions to invade homes on the reservation in the interest of an immediate type of danger to they're pursuing a homicide suspect. So this isn't, this is not an unusual arrangement in terms of how tribes respond to the criminal justice needs of their people. So sometimes there will be contracts. Sometimes there are prison or, carceral correctional institutions on reservations that actually take funding to house other types of federal prisoners. There's 3 juvenile centers in the United States for federal juvenile offenders who are detained. And there's only about 4,000 nationally, but a good number of those are Native American. And actually one of the 3 is right here in Rapid City, South Dakota. There is a threat whenever you have the border town to a reservation and a tribal community coming up against each other. You have a historical animosity, you have legal and jurisdictional challenges, and you usually have a strong kinship or familial relationship or history involved. And so the border town and the reservation have a much longer history than any jail they decided to build together. A lot of the funding that came down in the O's was all related to, building these facilities. And often, at least, in a tribal environment, I'm proud of the Lummi Business Council for saying, no, we will cancel our contract if you're going to kill our people. It's very likely that the Lummi do not have a state-of-the-art treatment center available to their tribal members. And often jail is the last resort for people who have limited access to healthcare. If all of our tribal governments would take such decisive action when any of these mainstream institutions kill our people, that could really help to push our movement forward in terms of, making sure that our lives matter and that this mass incarceration and carceral state we live in is destroyed.
Natalie,
not the state, but the carceral.
That's right. I want us to stick in your neighborhood, Natalie. South Dakota, there was a story on IndianCountryToday.com reporting about 2 South Dakota tribes that have filed federal complaints against election officials in the state of South Dakota, alleging voter suppression. The Oglala, y'all have to correct me as I butcher Indian names. I'm so sorry. Please give me the correct pronunciation. The Oglala Sioux tribe and the Rosebud Sioux tribe and 4 Directions filed a federal court complaint naming the South Dakota State Secretary, Steve Barnett, Social Services Secretary, Lori Gill, Labor and Regulation Secretary, Marsha Holtman, and Public Safety Secretary Craig Price. They are naming names. Don't play with the natives when it comes to lawsuits, because they will come to town prepared. Now, what the complaint says, according to Indian Country Today, they allege that these state officials have failed to provide voter registration applications during public benefits transactions that fall under the National Voter Registration Act. They also allege these officials have failed to update voter registration addresses when citizens report a change of address. And they've also failed to provide voter registration services to people who lack a driver's license or social security number. And here on First Nation Fridays, we have discussed this issue a little bit. Maybe we could talk a little bit about it more. But the unique challenges that face Indigenous people when it comes to barriers to voting, either in states that demand a lot of documentation, like birth certificates and a proper, so-called proper mailing address. For Indigenous people who lack these things, they have historically been denied the right to vote. And these voter suppression tactics continue forward even in the year 2020. And here we are, less than 2 months away from the general presidential election. And yet Natives are back in court again, demanding the things that have been legally promised to them and to others, and demonstrating that state officials are continuing to fail this community. Natalie, can you tell us about, if you know about this lawsuit, anything that you might know, but generally the challenges outlined by the complaint filed by these tribes, and tell us about 4 Directions. I was curious about that. Can you get into a little bit of all that?
Sure. 4 Directions is an advocacy organization that is focusing on the franchise and voting for Native Americans. O.J. Siemens and his family run the organization, his wife, Barbara, and they've been doing a lot of work on this for a number of years. I want to say, I was just looking in my memories, but like the old Native vote, which, first came out, I want to say in like 2012. Here in South Dakota. And I know that OJ was a part of that as well. And they have sued successfully. They've sued the state of South Dakota. They sued Jackson County in particular, a county that is encompassed in part by Rosebud Sioux, the Pine Ridge Reservation, the Oglala Sioux tribe. And so they settled then with the state and, agreed on sort of satellite voter registration type of remedies, and somehow making it more accessible. But, my take generally on lawsuits against the state of South Dakota is that they don't abide by if there's any adverse ruling to what they want to do, they do not abide by it. Then they'll be happy to get sued again. That's just the way that these agencies play here in South Dakota. North Dakota and South Dakota are often referred to as the Deep North. So when you look at the games that are played in Louisiana or Alabama or Mississippi or even Missouri regarding voter registration and voter suppression, that's exactly what's going on here in South Dakota, with a little bit of a different face in North Dakota. But certainly the accessibility of voting to the tribal members of the Oglala Sioux tribe and the Chichangu Lakota, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, there is no support for that. It is very clear to me, at least, that county, local, and state officials are not interested in Native Americans voting. We haven't seen any good faith compliance with the federal act that they're suing under regarding the Voter Registration Act. You don't see it in, we're 60 and 70% of the social services population often when it comes to something like, the EBT, the food stamps, or you have the TANF, or you have Medicaid. Medicaid is probably majority white. But, and there are many opportunities to enfranchise, register, and provide an opportunity to the people who receive these services. And they're just not doing it. It is very clear that the state of South Dakota is not only not interested in Native Americans voting, they're also not interested in Native Americans counting. And we see that as South Dakota is only one of 2 states that failed to form a complete count committee for the census 2020. We have seen no devotion from our, any time devoted to that issue. And we have significant gerrymandering, particularly in Sioux Falls and in Rapid City in South Dakota, which are not covered by the scope of that lawsuit, which is talking about the accessibility of Native American voters in a reservation context. And that really goes to sort of the rural aspects of it. Transportation, these are reservations with, 200-mile expanses between them to get to point A to point B. A round trip to just take care of ordinary business, get your mail, maybe pick up something from the tribal government is an all-day process for Native American voters. And so I'm looking forward to the result of this lawsuit. I think Native American Rights Fund has been doing some really awesome work to assist Dakota and Lakota people here in this region. And, and I really look to North Dakota as well, because for all of the data and the statistics that tell a certain story, North Dakota appears to have a much stronger relationship with its Native American tribes than the Governor Kristi Noem has here in South Dakota. I think it's important to note too that Governor Noem lost only by about she won only by about 3,000 or 4,000 votes, 3,500 something, I believe. There are almost 19,000 Native American voters in South Dakota from the last that I heard. And had we turned out, we would have been able to swing the election to her opponent, who was a gubernatorial candidate, Billy Sutton from the Democratic Party. And I think she's well aware of that and has actively sought to suppress both us being counted in the census as well as voting and registering to vote, in these elections here in South Dakota.
Johnnie J, I know you're living life as a Cali girl right now, but you are from the very red state of Oklahoma, which we know has had often hostile relationship with Native communities there. And without a doubt, the barriers for Indigenous folks to vote are a big mountain to climb in your home state as well. We know that this is a lawsuit filed in South Dakota, but what are some of the overlapping concerns regarding what the South Dakota tribes are suing on behalf of that you have seen, experienced, and are definitely aware of that has happened with your tribal nations as well?
Well, I think, when you look at all these issues, especially with the state government relationships with tribes, and especially now in this political climate, a lot of them are trying to undermine tribal sovereignty. They are looking for any way that they can to undermine Indigenous peoples and to undermine our rights. And, when Natalie was talking about how they suppress that Native vote, I just tweeted the other day that we need to vote as Native people. We don't have to agree with this system. We don't have to like it. But I think in this election, we need to turn out. And they fear our vote. We see this. If our vote did not have power, if our choice did not have power, they would not be working this hard to suppress those votes and to make sure that we did not have access to make those votes. And I see this accessibility to voting, is really hard for Indigenous people for the reasons that Natalie gave. You need transportation. A lot of simple things that we take for granted every day is an all-day task for Native people in some communities. And also, there are, contrary to popular belief that our languages are dying or dead, we do have a lot of people who do still only speak our native languages. And one of the rights that we have as American citizens is that we should have translators available to us to help us understand what it is we're voting on, who we're voting for. And when it comes to Indigenous people, we do not have those translators made available to us. So that also discourages Native voters who may not have a strong grasp on the English language as other people do. And so I see all these tactics, and the only thing that I keep coming back to is it's all just to undermine our tribal sovereignty and to try and finish out that job that the U.S. government has always wanted to do, which is to eradicate Indigenous people, to eradicate our agency and autonomy. And one of the ways that they do that is, especially with the census now, is that a large part of Native communities will not be counted in that census. It is going to look like our numbers are way lower than what they are right now because so many Natives will not be counted. And that's something that a lot of tribes are also suing for because, the deadline shifted. And there's also the way that they are counting the census this year. It's just all done to make it look like we are no longer here. It's all to contribute to our erasure in the larger landscape of Americana. And the reason that they're doing this and pushing so hard for this right now is because we have President Trump in office. And as we have seen in many Native communities, he has really gone hard in order to try and undermine tribal sovereignty and to eradicate federal recognition for tribes. And we've had 2 tribes so far that have been able to kind of, I wouldn't say escape unscathed, because, this is going to come up again, especially if he wins another term. He is going to keep pushing. But we've seen tribes that had their federal recognition questioned. We've seen Trump try to take tribal lands out of trust. We've seen him trying to privatize Native lands. And he's really doing this just because, if he can eradicate tribal sovereignty, then we lose all our lands. We lose our identity. And we'll always be Native people that we know our communities. We know we'll always be Native. But once the federal government no longer recognizes us, or if our numbers drop too low, that affects our funding. That affects the treaty rights. If we no longer exist, then all those treaty rights that we have will be voided. And that's one of the reasons that, Trump has really pushed for trying to challenge federal recognition of tribes, trying to take our lands, and especially in trying to undercount us as citizens of the U.S. Because once that happens, then they have more power to take and take and take, which is all they know how to do at this point. So I think it is really important that we start looking at making sure that we have informed Native voters, that we help them get registered, and that we also start trying to help with transportation to and from voting facilities, and also legally challenging counties and even states where they are closing voting stations in Native communities. And, that's something that we're seeing a lot of this year, is that there's a lot of polling places that they're closing down, and they're like, well, you're going to have to go to this one. And a lot of people will not have access to that polling center. So this is something that we need to be aware of in this election year. And, I'm one of those people that for the longest time was not a voter because I didn't want to be complicit in this system. I set out. I was like, nope, I'm not going to do this. But, the more I realized that, for every person who doesn't vote, there's somebody who is. And they are not going to vote for our best interest. They are not going to be voting for the political candidates that are looking to help America. They're looking for those ones who are going to help their best interest. And a lot of their best interest means taking native land, taking native resources, and, just kind of helping the government do what they've always wanted to do, which is eradicate the Indian problem. So as long as natives aren't voting, there's always somebody who is going to be voting for the eradication of the Indian problem. So I think that's why, for me, it's important as a native person to get out there and vote, especially in this election year.
Absolutely. Natalie, did you want to make a last point on this before we head to our next point?
Sure. Just that our people don't have access to fees, to money to buy their identification. I think Johnnie really listed out a lot of the barriers that people are facing, but one of them is that paperwork and those badges, and it costs $30 a pop for most people, and who has an extra $30 in this environment just to spend on that? And I think that ends up being a huge barrier for a lot of our Indian people who are trying to go to the polls, is proving who they are.
The next and final aspect of that I want us to get into before we close out today's show has to do with Native representation in mainstream entertainment spaces. And Dwayne, if you could pop up one of those tweets from Johnnie J, because Johnnie J does not lack for smoke and fire for those who want to distort the imagery of Native people. And a big problem has to do with Hollywood casting non-natives to play natives in 2020. Johnnie J tweeted, Kelsey as Billy Chow. I hope I'm saying this young lady's name right. I can't pronounce anybody's name, apparently. Kelsey Chow is not native. Repeat, Kelsey Chow is not native. And white ass Hollywood needs to quit casting her in native roles. She also needs to stop taking opportunity from native women who are far more talented and deserving. Dwayne, next tweet from Johnnie J. Yes, read more here because our native talent deserves better. And how awful for actual natives to have to work side by side with her and never be able to call her, the directors or producers, out for the sake of their own jobs. Brilliant point there, Johnnie J. It's hard to call out misrepresentation and miscasting when you're just so happy to have a job. And, Johnnie J, I was sort of taken by this when I saw this on your Twitter feed, because I'm like, hold on. Now, my mama's a boomer, right? So what does my mama like to sit around and watch? Westerns, okay? Gunsmoke, Cheyenne. What else does mama watch? Tales of Wells Fargo. And we know for many decades, Hollywood was happy to cast white men in red face to play Native Americans. Just an abhorrent practice, which, number one, denied Native people roles on film, on screen, but also helped to perpetuate so much harmful stereotypes about Native people and their culture and everything about them. Johnnie J, why is this still a thing in 2020? And who is Kelsey Chow, and why is she happy to take work away from Native actresses?
Well, Kelsey is really known for two projects right now. Wind River, which was huge, simply because it was one of the first mainstream families to even broach the murdered and missing Indigenous women. And she is also the star in Yellowstone, which is another film that has a huge Native cast and deals with a lot of Native issues, yet she is cast as the main Native, very much the way she was in Wind River. And she claims to be Eastern Band Cherokee, but the Eastern Band Cherokee, when she started making her claims, actually released a letter to say that she was not an enrolled member, and that as far as they could find in their record, she was not even a descendant. And the reason that this persists, and especially for the Cherokee people, is that it's the only tribe that a lot of people are really familiar with. So many natives so many non-natives will come up to you as a Native person, and you're making conversation and you're getting to know each other, and then it never fails that somewhere in that conversation, the the Cherokee great grandmother shows up. Or, in one of my cases, I was dating a guy, and when our families met for the first time, his family was so proud to start talking about their native relative, who was Princess Summer Winterfall. And if you don't know who that is, it's because you're way too young and you've never seen Howdy Doody. Howdy Doody had a native princess puppet who was Princess Summer, Fall, Winter, Spring. I know I'm mixing that all up, but his family was so proud to claim her as an ancestor. And my family, was dying because we didn't want to laugh and be rude. But as soon as we left, of course, that's exactly what we did. And I've never lived that down. But, non-natives will constantly claim native identities. And there's a huge reason for that. And it's not because they are proud of that heritage or they want to be a part of our communities. It's so that they can undermine our communities, because most of the time when they do claim native identities, it is to justify racism towards Indigenous people. It's to silence Indigenous people. Like, these are the reasons that we see people in mass claiming to be native these days. And when it comes to media, Indian country is so small. I've said it several times on this show. We are less than 2% of the entire US population. So when you look at natives in entertainment and in the film industry, we're an even smaller fraction of that. And we have such wonderful talent, and they just never get the opportunities that non-natives get, especially when filmmakers really would rather cast non-natives in that role of native than to deal with native people. And I look at that when they cast her in Wind River. Wind River touched on the murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is a very touchy subject for Indian country, because so many of us, especially as women, have either experienced violence, or we know someone who has, or we have a loved one who is among the murdered and missing Indigenous women. So it's a very sensitive subject. And I think for me, like, Wind River was not a good movie for me. And I really wish I hadn't seen it. And I wish there had been a lot of trigger warnings involved for Native women going to see the movie, just because of the graphic nature of the movie. And the reason that I think that they tend to cast non-natives in these roles is because non-natives don't know any better. They won't second guess these roles or what is being asked of them to portray on film in terms of how they're dealing with Native people, our identities, and our communities. So they don't ask questions, they'll just do it. And so that's one of the reasons we see such huge misrepresentation, just because they don't know any better. Whereas if you had cast a Native actress in that role, she may have been asking questions. She may have asked, why does this have to be so graphic? Why do we have to do this? Why does this have to come up? And trying to get some more accuracy in there, like, well, this isn't what Native would do in this situation, or this isn't what a Native community is. This isn't our story or our narrative. Like, they would be challenging that. And I think that's one of the reasons that they are so apt just to cast these non-natives, because they don't want to deal with the hassle of actually having to work towards providing authentic Native representation or allowing Native voices to be heard in their film, because they just want to do what they want to do. And we've seen that recently outside of Wind River and, Yellowstone. You've seen this happening in other areas of entertainment as well, especially with the recent episode of Lovecraft Country, which should have been a phenomenal episode. There was so much potential there, because Lovecraft Country is really groundbreaking in the way that they have allowed Black filmmakers to be involved, to help shape this story. And the first 3 episodes of this series were incredible to me as a Native, to see how mindful and careful they were of painful Black history and how they portrayed that into this story. So when I heard that there was going to be Native representation, I was a little excited, like, yes, but I was also a little weary, because I know how often it goes horribly wrong. And it did in this case, because it should have been a win. This would have been one of the first episodes where we had Two-Spirit representation, and it was bad. It was really bad, mainly because, just like with other films, Natives are used as props. We're not there to be a part of the story oftentimes. We're there to be a prop. We're there to be the object of violence. We're there to push the hero forward. And in order to push that hero forward, a lot of times that means that Native people are going to be horribly, horribly treated, whether it's through depictions of racism or whether through graphic violence. And that's exactly what happened in this show. And it was very horrible to me because Two-Spirit identity is so misrepresented and misunderstood as it is. And so for them to take a shallow definition and to really just kind of give it to this character that had no depth, no real meaning, it was horrible to see it. It was just 5 minutes of this show, but it did such a huge disservice to Two-Spirit people. And not only in just kind of perpetuating that anti-Native racism that we're so used to, but also perpetuating queerphobia and trying to justify it as being part of what's necessary to push their heroes forward in their story. And it's not necessary. Like this character in the first place wasn't even in the book. So the whole scene, the whole part of this was absolutely unnecessary. They didn't need to do it. But I also think that they kind of got wrapped up in the wokeness of the show and wanting to kind of further that groundbreaking reputation that they had garnered by including Indigenous people, and not only including Indigenous people, but including Indigenous queer representation, which is so lacking within the media. But I think it got the best of them because it was something that seemed rushed, disjointed. So I don't think they did the necessary collaboration with Native people to make sure they got this story right. They didn't do the research on what it was to be a Two-Spirit person. They just put this character up there to be an object of violence, to be brutally murdered, and to call it entertainment. So, it was kind of disappointing, but also in the larger grand scheme of things, they also did a huge disservice to Black Indigenous people because the character that they had was Arawak. And Arawak is a South American, Caribbean group of people. And so they really did a disservice to Black Indigenous people by erasing that identity to cast a North American Native American in that role. So it's a mess when it comes to Native representation in the media. But it has an impact on how people view us. And we've been talking about stereotypes throughout this whole show and the impact that it has, like what we have to contend with in order for us to even get a job, to go to school. Like we have to contend with these stereotypes just because people have these misconceptions of who we are so ingrained in their DNA that it makes it impossible for us to just go in and be seen as a human being just like anybody else. We first have to get proved that we are not the alcoholic, that we're not the drug users, that we're smart, that we're capable, and it's terrible. But that's part of the reason why we talk about media representation so much, because it helps inform people. It helps shape their perception of, Native people. And when you're so misrepresented, it becomes true. And so, when I see these actresses claiming that that they're Native to get these Native roles and to be elevated to speak on Native issues, my mind is blown. And that's the case with Kelsey Asbill Chow, because, she has a video where she's talking about the murdered and missing Indigenous women. And I'm just like, wow, like the disassociation that you have to have with what you're doing, because you're literally contributing to the erasure of actual Native women by taking on these roles of Native women and actually speaking on these issues and not allowing Native women to speak or to even portray themselves in a film. And it comes down to not only, just the fault of filmmakers and, storytellers, but also it comes down to these actors too having the ability to say no when they are offered a role that they know that they shouldn't be taking, or in claiming an identity that doesn't belong to them. I mean, it's just a huge mess, but it comes down to personal responsibility in a sense to not do it, and to understand that, hey, Natives are underrepresented, they're misrepresented, and we need to do better, and we need to be better allies by saying no when we are offered these roles, and to help Native entertainment and our actors get the opportunities that they so desperately deserve and need.
Natalie, I'd like to get your take on people usurping Native culture, basically claiming Native heritage in order to acquire a role or even a position. I'm thinking of Elizabeth Warren, people pulling this native heritage out of their butt, basically out of nowhere where it doesn't exist. And shout out to the Eastern Band of the Cherokee for saying, no, bitch, we got receipts. You are not down with the tribe. We know, we see you, Kelsey Chow. You are not among us. But obviously, this has been something that has been perpetuated since the advent of the moving pictures, right? Native American culture specifically being appropriated by white America, by Black America sometimes. And the fact that this continues as pretty much standard practice, as we've seen this particular Asian American actress be cast repeatedly in the roles of Native women, Hollywood is content just to keep erasing actual Native people from American entertainment.
The first film ever made, right, was The Great Train Robbery. It was a Western. And the Western genre continues to be defined by this complex, in and out of the stereotypes of Indigenous people, the colonial agenda to erase us, and also the colonial agenda to fix us in history and in the past. I think the entertainment industry perpetuates a lot of the ignorance and stereotypes by casting people who are not Native in these roles. Because most people don't know Native Americans in real life, and most people just simply don't know. I see the same thing playing out with COVID-19 and the pandemic here in South Dakota. Most of us as Native Americans know somebody who has COVID. Most of the white people here do not know anybody with COVID. And so the proportion, I think, really matters. In terms of the entertainment, I love Lovecraft Country, and I tried to take my critical eye away from the last episode, and then I saw Johnnie J posting about it, tweeting about it. I'm like, she's not wrong. And, I think we need to look at who has the power in the entertainment industry and what agendas are they fulfilling by continuing to cast people who have no ties to our communities? Because often I think, and Asian American actresses, for instance, they're very much oppressed and underrepresented in the entertainment industry. And then here we have, Ms. Chow taking up a number of really important Native American parts. Wind River was produced by Miramax. Harvey Weinstein was part of that. And, I want to bring up Misty Upham, that the narrative of violence against Indigenous women is one thing. And then there's the actual violence that is levied upon Indigenous women in the industry who are trying and who are attempting to be the artists and be the craftsmen, the actors and actresses for our people and to represent us in the entertainment industry, and the barriers that they face and the oppression that they face. It's very real. Misty was alleged to have been a victim of sexual assault by people affiliated with the Weinstein Company. And so this doesn't just play out, right, in the fiction or the episode or the film. This plays out in real life for our Indian people who are in Hollywood and trying to make it. I want to see an A-list celebrity who is Indigenous. I want to see American Indians, members of federally recognized tribes with ties to their communities, who cast in these parts that are supposed to be telling our stories. And I think it's really important for our youth. I think it's really important for broader race relations. And I think that we have in our community a lot of white people interested in us. We need to get those other communities of color and that coalition that working together. And I know that the Screen Actors Guild has a really strong diversity coalition. And I know there's a number of the folks who take leadership there on behalf of us as Native Americans. And those kind of efforts need to continue, and a harsh accountability needs to take place in terms of these fake Indians trying to take our slots. Because guess what? We need those checks. We have been deprived intergenerationally. It is going to take generations for us to get out of that. Poverty is for generations for for us to, address the aspects of our impoverishment. And so I really am about trying to get those checks over to our people. Basic, bottom line.
Pay Native women. Pay up. Pay them full scale. Pay them like you pay white women, okay? Or even better yet, pay them like you pay white men.
I was just going to say, wait a second. White men. We let the white men pay.
That's right. We trying to get them white male pay scales out here. Don't pay us like men, for God's sakes. I have to thank you both. Thank you guys so much for being part of First Nation Friday today. We've been joined with Natalie Means. Natalie is the founder of, am I saying this right now, HeSapa, the HeSapa Voter Initiative. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Right here in the Black Hills.
And where can people find out about the HeSapa Voter Initiative? You have a website?
We just got started. We're on Facebook. We do have a Twitter account, HeSapa Voter Initiative, on Instagram and on Twitter. We're trying to get that Snapchat and that TikTok before Trump bans us up and going. And we have a really strong COVID response project right now that's providing food, cleaning supplies, and natural medicines to our Lakota people in Rapid City. So any support would be much appreciated. Thank you.
All right. You guys heard it. And of course, Johnnie J. We love you so much, Johnnie J. Your beautiful, smiling, glowing face every other Friday. I do look forward to seeing it. And you got to follow Johnnie J on Twitter because it is full. Her timeline is full of smoke and fire. And she got it for everybody. So tune in to Johnnie J on Twitter. Thank you, babe. We appreciate you being here. And of course, we're going to send love out to Desiree, Kane, and Jen Deerenwater. We miss you guys, and we will see you on the next First Nation Friday. Thanks to everyone who stood around or stuck around and have been watching us this whole time. Of course, we do this every other Friday here on Stir Crazy. I'm your host, Kim Brown. Don't forget, we are in the middle of a fundraising drive here at The Real News. Go to therealnews.com/donate. Drop us some coins so we can keep bringing you this kind of content that nobody else is bringing you. In the meantime, we will see y'all on Tuesday for the next episode of Stir Crazy. Guys, have a great weekend. COVID is still out here jumping on people. Wash your hands, wear your mask, social distance. See ya. Bye.